Good afternoon and welcome. I am Joe Freudenheim, the chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Environmental Health. We're very pleased to welcome you today to the celebration of the 100th anniversary of our department. We're thrilled that so many faculty, staff, and students from the present and past of the department have been able to join us here to mark this important event, to celebrate all that's been accomplished and to think about where we're going next. We have a lot of history to celebrate, and I fully expect that the department and everyone associated with it will continue to build a new history of achievements. I hope that everyone has a wonderful time in the next few days and that you come away with a new appreciation of all that has gone on in this department. We are in fact one of the oldest departments, schools in the country, and an enormous amount of science, leadership of the field, and training of outstanding scientists has come out of EEH. I want to thank SAS for their sponsorship of this 100th celebration. There we go. As most of you know, we have an annual lecture commemorating Saxon Graham and his contributions to the department and to the field of epidemiology more generally. This is the 13th time we've had this lecture. It's especially fitting this year to include the lecture as an integral part of the celebration. Dr. Saxon Graham was a longtime UB professor and chair of our department between 1981 and 1991. He was an internationally known cancer epidemiologist, most well known for his groundbreaking studies on diet and cancer, beginning in the 1950s, at a time when the prevailing wisdom was that it was not possible to study diet using epidemiology. At that time, most such work was done in animal models. The impact of Dr. Graham's example of research excellence persists in his continuing example to all of us and in this annual lecture. Further, as he pointed out in an interview that we did with him when we were first putting the lectureship together, Saxon considered the impact that he had on students and other mentees that he worked with to be one of the most important parts of his legacy. In recognition of that legacy, we have 2 graduate student awards that have been funded by generous gifts in his name from alumni, faculty, and friends. It's my honor to announce the winner of this year's Saxon Graham Award for Overall Excellence, Academic Excellence. This award goes to a recent graduate of our PhD program. It's a recognition of overall excellence in all aspects of the program, including the quality of research. The student must have had active engagement in data collection. I'm very pleased to announce that this year's Saxon Graham Award for Overall Academic Excellence goes to Dr. David Jacobs. David is an outstanding example of the extent to which the field of epidemiology, while it's always been interdisciplinary, is now increasingly so. He has a breadth of expertise. Dave had a PharmD before he started the PhD, and now he has a PhD in epidemiology. He did his research on relationships between bacteria, exacerbations, and hospitalizations in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In that work, he brought together epidemiology, pharmacy, and health services research. Dr. Jacobs is now a tenure-track assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacy Practice in the School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences here at UB. He's a K-12 faculty scholar in implementation science. In addition, he is PI or MPI on 3 grants. He's published extensively in the time since he's been at UB, including papers related to COPD and his dissertation research. He's received an impressive array of awards, including recently being selected as a finalist and a semi-finalist for his research posters at international and national pharmacy meetings. We're extremely proud of David and his accomplishments. Please join me in congratulating him. In addition, I want to recognize the recipient of this year's Saxon Graham Research Award, Zainab Farhat. One of the tests is, can you get up to the stage? The Saxon Graham Research Award is particularly important in that it provides funds for doctoral students for their research. This award was initiated with Dr. Graham, his son Saxon Graham Jr., and Dr. Jim Marshall. The award provides funds to assist PhD students with their dissertation research. And as an aside, we have a new fund for our EAH students as part of the 100th celebration. That new fund will allow us to provide assistance to additional students with stipends, tuition support, travel to meetings, and other expenses of that kind. Many of you have generously contributed to that fund, and I want to thank you for those contributions. Zainab, this year's recipient of the award, started in the EEH PhD program in 2015. She came to UB with an MPH from Long Island University and an interest in cancer epidemiology. She's a fellow on our T32 Cancer Training Grant, and that is a collaboration between EEH and cancer researchers at Roswell Park. Zainab's been an exceptional student in the PhD program in every way, in her scholarship, her contributions to the EEH student organization, as a teaching assistant, and as a research assistant on a variety of projects. Everything she does extremely well. Am I embarrassing you? That's good. For this award, she received funds to assist her in conducting her research on garlic and cancer prevention under the guidance of her mentor, Dr. Lena Mu. Her dissertation research includes a broad integration of methodologies. She's doing an epidemiologic analysis of a large cohort study. She's conducting both chemical and in vitro experiments evaluating the antioxidant and anti-proliferative activities of several forms of garlic. Finally, she's conducting a small intervention study as a pilot for a randomized trial examining antioxidant effects of garlic consumption. She plans to continue research in cancer prevention after her PhD. We're also very proud of Zainab and her accomplishments. She's on a steep trajectory. I certainly expect to hear more about her continuing success as she moves on in her career. Please join me in congratulating her. I'm now pleased to introduce to you Dr. John Vena, our Saxon Graham lecturer for 2019. Many of our Saxon Graham lecturers have had a connection with Dr. Graham as his colleague or as his mentee. In Dr. Vena's case, he was both of these. Here we have some then and now photo. The guy has not changed at all. John received his PhD in epidemiology from UB and then was appointed as an assistant professor in this department. He was here until 2003 with promotions to associate and full professor. He served as the EEH associate chair with Saxon and had a number of other leadership positions at UB, including directing the Environment and Society Institute. He was recruited from UB to become the chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics of the department at the University of South Carolina, followed by becoming chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of Georgia College of Public Health. And since 2014, he's held the position of professor and founding chair in the Department of Health Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina. John is a leader in environmental epidemiology. He is currently MPI of a large cohort examining in utero exposures in relation to child health outcomes. In addition, he has major involvement in several other studies, including continuing involvement with the police study here at UB with Dr. John Violanti. John Vena has published more than 100 manuscripts. Dr. Vena is a fellow of the American College of Epidemiology and the American Epidemiological Society. He's published extensively in the field of environmental and occupational epidemiology, including studies of air and water pollution, bladder cancer and drinking water contaminants, health of municipal workers, including firefighters and police officers, and persistent environmental toxicants. He has contributed as well to the next generation of epidemiologists. He's mentored a very large number of students, MPH, MS, and PhD, as well as taking leadership in a number of significant training programs. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Vena, who is not only an important leader and scholar, but also a very good friend. He will be giving a talk, Errors in Epidemiology, Embracing Our Past to Chart the Future. Please give a warm welcome to our 2019 Saxon Graham Lecturer, Dr. John Vena.
Dean Wachowski-Wendy, Chair Freudenheim, and renowned alumni, faculty, students, friends, family. It's wonderful to be here. And when Joe said, well, gee, it's a 100-year anniversary, can you cover 100 years? And I thought, oh my God, how am I going to do that? But then I thought, if I had a time machine, we could do it. And then I said, well, if we're going to do 100 years, why not do 150 years, right? And so we're going to go on a little time machine, and some eras, which I also want to recognize that Charles Nation, who's a student, medical student, who's on leave, helped me the last couple months pulling all this together. So recognize Charles. So these are the eras, and we're going to do time travel through these different eras. But to assist in this time travel, in our time machine, we developed a little lookbook. So does everybody have a little lookbook? Okay. And so you can look through that as we travel through time, giving the background of the success of our department. So the first era is growing knowledge, 1843 to 1890. And medicine had a transformative time during the Victorian era, and the development of many concepts we now consider foundational and basic. But chief among those was the advances made in this era and the foundation of epidemiology and one of its founding fathers, Austin Flint. I'm going to quickly go through his time period because many of you know the history from our Centennial. But he recognized the epidemiologic approach and established institutions that are really the founding of of what we do. And this is a 1851 map, and it says coach and rails. What kind of coaches do you think that was? Stage coaches and railroad. And you can see that from here, New York's down here, and you can see the waterways and railroads coming through, and then stagecoach lines. And so this is let's see if I can advance this. So this is a blow-up picture. And this is Buffalo, right? And these are, and then this is the rail line, and right here is Olean, New York, where I was born and raised. And right in here is where Austin Flint, with the red arrow, this is 100 years later, 1952 map of Western New York. And so that's where Austin Flint was called to investigate his epidemic. Before we go there, also in Olean, New York, those two counties, Allegheny and Cattaraugus, were developed by Devereux, William Devereux, and he called to Rome and said, send Franciscan friars to Olean to start a university. So they started 1858 St. Bonaventure University in Olean, New York. This is St. Bonaventure today, nestled in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains, called the Enchanted Mountains, right? So that's Olean. And this is Austin Flint, 1846, and he and a few other fellows founded the UB Medical School. And the future president, Millard Fillmore, then a lawyer and New York representative, was named the first chancellor of the university, which was kind of honorary. So that's pretty cool, right? And then this was where they had the first classes, and it was recognized in the Buffalo Medical Journal. They were all excited about starting their new classes. The legendary founders were really significant in medicine at the time. James Platt White, pioneer in obstetrics, of course Austin Flint, and Frank Hastings Hamilton, a surgeon who then became the first dean and chair of surgery at UB. And this is a lot about Austin Flint. I'm going to quickly go through this, but say that he established in 1846 the Buffalo Medical Journal, and he was professor for 6 years and then moved on and did a bunch of other stuff. But you have to note that he was president of the New York Academy of Medicine from 1872 to 1885, and president of the American Medical Association in 1884. So Austin Flint achieved the distinction of all these things that I just mentioned. And this is how he was described: tall, handsome, and manly form with a well-modulated voice of great compass. He's a lecturer at once clear, distinct, and inspiring. So you can imagine this guy, and it's on the front cover of your lookbook. He's formidable, right? And he was called by the county superintendent of the poor at 31 years of age to go to North Boston, right? And this is what he looked like then. And this is where he was called to in North Boston, Fuller's Tavern. And surrounding, and this is the well. You can barely see the wellhead. And he describes in his paper the privy, which was over in this way, so many rods. I can't remember what he said, 4 rods or something like that, which I'm not sure what a rod is, but anyway. He stayed for 8 hours, and he came to the following conclusions. He did an autopsy, he looked at the clinical signs and symptoms, and he determined it was typhoid fever. And then he attributed to a young traveler from Boston or Warwick, Mass, of all places, who was on the stagecoach line and got off there because he was ill. And then he ended up, as it turns out, contaminated the well. 21 days later, everyone in the town started to get sick, except for one family. And so the epidemic was propagated, what he said, by contagion, and infected families, including the innkeeper, Fuller, and his family members. And the paper is riveting when you read it. It was published in the American Journal of Medical Sciences. You can see it here, number 2. And it's really fascinating. He describes to detail what happened to every family and took copious notes and wrote it up. And then, I'm not going to read all this, but basically there was only one family, the Stearnses, in town that didn't get ill, because they were feuding with the Fullers, and the Fullers wouldn't let them use their well. So good for them, right? So in 1845, they attributed the transmission to contagion, which really was important because it opposed the prevalent miasmatic theory of contagion. So he was a pioneer. He said, look, it's not that. It has to be something. So anyway, now we go to John Snow, considered the father of epidemiology, right? He wrote it up in 1849. He had his famous oration in London in 1853. But you see Flint's paper was 1843. These are the references for his oration. And then here is a link, if you want to read it, in the entire John Snow's oration. And this is what he said, intending to show that typhoid fever, yellow fever, plague, cholera are communicated by accidentally swallowed warm excretions of the patient. These later may sometimes be conveyed with their drinking water and other direct diet without losing their specific profiles. Reference 18. Well, reference 18 is, Dr. Jenner lately called my attention to an instance accounting for the village of North Boston, Erie County, right? The number of families' contamination of the water of the well, which they use. So John Snow got some of his ideas from Austin Flint, right? Is that cool or what, right? So reference. And then also at the time, this is a writing by Flint. The Medical Association met and they discussed the diagnostic criteria for epidemic cholera. So they were discussing it, studying it, making sure that they were doing the best medically for folks who got these diseases at the time. So not only that, but Flint then followed up in 1873, and he reformulated his ideas about what happened. And he was the keynote speaker for the very first meeting of the American Public Health Association in 1873, which was in Cincinnati. And this is what he looked like at the time. Right? You like those chops? Right? So this is his paper. So we have, by the way, we have copies of all the papers and references for all the stuff we did, and it's going to be in an archive for you guys to look at later. So here's his paper, and and Winkelstein in his paper at our Centennial mentioned that the discovery of the causation of typhoid fever through this medium has led to the inquiry whether other diseases may not be traced to drinking water and further researchers may shed light on the causation of numerous diseases. That's a quote from Austin Flint's address. As regard prevention, the diffusion by contagion is to be avoided by the disinfection, et cetera, et cetera. So he really came full around and made full conclusions about his paper many years later at the first APHA meeting. So now we're at the era, time for action. How are we doing on our time? Okay, we're going, okay, so we're going to the next era. Are you ready? You got your seatbelts fastened? Okay, we're gonna go fast. So encompassing the progressive era, as well as the New Deal, 2 world wars, and coinciding with this is to bring about changes and a similar change according to a similar paradigm in epidemiology. So there's foundation of institutions, both public and private, dedicated to the improvement of public health, which experts focus on the advancement of epidemiologic knowledge and methodology, and the establishment of both public and private policies to promote public health. So the era was truly revolutionary as the scene of public health innovation shifted to New York, and for their public health policy first fully implemented the new knowledge of epidemiology and bacteriology in public health practice. As in previous areas, Western New York is at the forefront of these trends, peopled by individuals whose purpose, policies undertake research and found institutions that pursue public health by many means. So this area of epidemiology is marked by efforts which substantially validate the value and broad principles of epidemiology as we know it today. So this interdisciplinary reform, right, is sanitation and curbing infectious disease, the rise of the germ theory. So West New York was critical in early adoption of this new synthesis of ideas, and it's highly evident by the way the curricula of the medical school is transformed during that time. And this is 1891. A course, emphasizing the growing importance in medicine. Preventive medicine as a branch of medical science has commanded more and more recognition with the progress of bacteriology investigations and knowledge of hygiene for the preservation of the public as well as individual health is at present indispensable to the practicing physician, right? And this was only 7 years after Cook's postulates was published. And in 1912, they added school health programs, techniques of vaccination, vital statistics, infectious disease control, including garbage disposal, home sanitation, assignment of, and this is, medical students were assigned a sanitary survey of a city district in the 3rd year of their program to be completed and presented as a report to graduation. Wow, right? And this hands-on community-focused approach is a remarkably clear reflection of the growing sense that medicine isn't just about practicing on the individual, but also the population level, right? Other things of note we'll get back to later. 1894, William Love begins navigable power canal in Niagara Falls for his model city. Because you needed direct current, you needed to have the current right where the city. 1895, Nikola Tesla develops alternating current. Model city was never developed and the canal was abandoned. 1898, Gratwick Research Laboratory in Roswell Park is founded. The first cancer institution or cancer hospital in the whole country, right? Then guess what? Buffalo was the host of the American Public Health Association National Meeting in 1896. And then again in 1901. We couldn't find much about the 1896 other than this paper wowed everybody and that they demonstrated the first time the feasibility of sending blood dried on paper long distances through the mails and then making the diagnosis. Wow. Biomarkers, right? Screening with paper. Incredible, right? But this is really the fascinating. At the 1901 APHA meeting, it coincided with the Pan American Exposition. And this is the address of welcome by Ainsley Wilcox under shadow of an awful calamity, which was the assassination of McKinley. And we are called to welcome you to the city of Buffalo. Our mayor, an honored member of your profession, is following the mortal remains of the late president. And then we welcome you with all our hearts to the city of Buffalo, right? That's what Buffalo is about, right? Welcoming people where public sanitation has been studied. We're proud of our beautiful city, for all of its streets are clean, its water supply abundant, its sewage system wisely planned, and then the main is well carried out, its ashes and garbage are well removed and well cared for, and its death rate, I believe, is among the lowest, and if not the lowest in the country, and that means the world. Wow. Ainsley Wilcox, this is 2 days after Teddy Roosevelt was inaugurated on the steps of his mansion in Delaware. Now, what I found is this link online is the every single paper presented at the 1901 APHA meeting. It's astounding to read through it, right? And also at the end, it lists all the members in the whole country of the APHA by their district. And here are the Buffalo contingency. And look at this, Ernest Wendy and John Wendy. Any relation? You don't know? What? Of course. Of course. They have to be, right? Here's the Pan American Exposition. And the mayor who was escorting McKinley's body to his resting place was a guy by the name of, I had to look this up, I had no idea. Anybody of you know this? He was the mayor, Conrad Deal. He was a physician at Buffalo General, and he was the mayor. He's the one who invited McKinley to the exposition, and he was at his side when he was shot. Right? Fascinating. Now, let's move to Wade Hampton Frost. Well, it turns out that Wade Hampton Frost spent time in Buffalo in the Public Health Service in 1910 to 1913. And he published in 1913 this incredible document called Hygienic Laboratory Bulletin Number 90, where he conducted research by and large in Buffalo, Batavia, etc., at the Ernest Wendy Hospital, Hygienic Laboratory. It's historic because the studies were conducted under uniform protocols with standard questionnaires. You can look in the document and the questionnaire is there. It's unbelievable, right? And then a relative first, but he introduced the concept of the secondary attack rate, by which he provided some of the first evidence supporting not only the possibility of asymptomatic carriers, but also that polio is primarily transmitted by asymptomatic carriers. The first time, studies done in Buffalo. And this is the bulletin, and this is a chart showing the seasonal distribution of polio in Buffalo in all its wards, and it's not unusual, and it's, that it begins in the late spring and summer, etc. You can see it, and that's a portrait of Wade Hampton Frost. So if you look in your lookbook, you can kind of see some of the pictures as we go along. Now, so this is 1910, and this is when my grandparents, Anthony and Carmela, this is an older picture of them, but they emigrated to the United States. And my grandmother's brothers lived in Olean, New York, so guess where they went? Olean, New York. And this guy on the right, John Kasprichin, and when he got to Ellis Island, they said, okay, your name's Casper. And he's my great-grandfather, and that's why I'm named after, John. So we'll get back to that later. So anyway, Frost, his mentor, his greatest academic legacy may have been the mentoring and empowerment he provided his graduate students. And he went to Hopkins in 1919. He was the first professor of epidemiology, helped found the school basically. He trained a generation of epidemiologists and public health workers. But guess what? Guess where he sent them? He sent them to Western New York. Mort Levine, Gene Downs, Archibald Dean, Abraham Lilienfeld were all his mentees. And they were sent to Western New York to undertake pioneering research in our region. Then the 1918 influenza pandemic occurs, right? 50 to 100 million people died. The case fatality rate's 2.5%, and 20 to 40-year-olds are mostly, and we could go a whole week talking about that epidemic, right? But what was really interesting about it is that push to form the Department of Hygiene and Public Health, which was in 1919, amidst the end of the war, so this organization which is the predecessor, goes to serve as a hotbed of research. And Dr. Walter Goodale, did you ever hear of this guy? He was the superintendent of the Buffalo City Hospital, which is now known as Erie County Medical Center. And his actions during the influenza epidemic were remarkable. He had strict public health measures based on the theory of contagion, by the way, to limit assembly, commandeered half the city's hospital beds, pressed medical students into service. He had engineered a public health victory. There were 4% lower morbidity in Buffalo than anywhere else in the country. In 1919, he was named the first head of the department, and the city hospital became the teaching hospital for UB Medical School. And by the way, he created the first 3-year residency program for medical students in the country. So Dr. Goodale, animated by the spirit of the age, introduced the curriculum. And what did he introduce? Industrial and social medicine, meatpacking plants, and piggeries. I love that term, right? As well as hearty cooperation of the Charity Organization Society, the Bureau of Public Welfare, the Children's Aid Society, the District Nursing Association, and he made sure that students got hygiene, sanitation, medical jurisprudence, economics, ethics, and history. Wow, right? And on top of his standardized instruction, he also formalized students with government institutions, integrating partnerships with state and local health departments, sanitation officers. Brilliant, right? And then another thing happened. 1923, the Milbank Foundation, in collaboration with the New York State Charities, and these are the Milbanks here on the right, nice couple, right? They established the very first county health department in the country. Guess where? Cattaraugus County, Olean, New York, right? And they were interested in the application, development, field testing of public health programs in predominantly rural settings. In 1927, Reginald Atwater, who later became executive director of APHA, became the county health officer. And they brought in 1926 to Cattaraugus County a woman by the name of Jean Downs, who was captivated by the epidemiology of tuberculosis and tractable burden on public health and major focus at the county health department, and caused her to work. She worked all over New York and Baltimore for the foundation, but her work in Western New York included 7 publications to reduce and informed how to reduce transmission of TB. A study of the risk attack among contacts in tuberculosis families in rural area 1935 is considered to be one of the most rigorous and interesting for her time. By means of exposure in person years, predicted community incidence rates, predicted versus observed ratios, age stratification of samples, and other epidemiologic measures, she was the first, if not the very first, to demonstrate the important epidemiologic features of TB, including bimodal virulence, increased intrafamily incidence, and variation in virulence by age. Phenomenal. This is Jean Downs right here, next to her mentor, Wade Hampton Frost. This is the county health department in Olean, New York, the Stone House, which I have no idea where it was, where it is. It's obviously long gone, but anyway, fascinating, right? Then guess what? The APHA is hosted in Buffalo again in 1926, right? And it was at the Hotel Statler, right? Can you imagine the Hotel Statler filled with APHA people from all over the country? Phenomenal, right? And it's really interesting to read this. So this is just a description and welcome, kind of, and what you can do. But guess what? They did tours of factories. They also did a tour to Cattaraugus County, to the Cattaraugus County Health Department, for public health people from all over the country. It's like, oh my God, this is like something out of a storybook, right? You can't make this stuff up, right? Then in 1930, Archibald Dean, another student of Wade Hampton Frost, was appointed regional health officer in Western New York. And guess where he was called to investigate an epidemic of typhoid fever? Olean, New York. 248 cases, 25 deaths. And it was sewage contamination and inadequate chlorination of 2 wells. As Dean put it, the outbreak was easily shown to be waterborne. He investigated other aspects of the investigation, though, the incidence of carriers, the complications of vaccination in school children, and the costs of the epidemic. Right? So it was a formidable work. So I'm not going to read all this, but it has some of the details. But one interesting note is during the epidemic, 3,151, or 59% of Olean school children, received 3 inoculations of New York State's brand new typhoid vaccine. As far as is known, this is the first mass use of typhoid vaccine ever. And then he published it and talked about the cost benefit of the typhoid fever epidemic, how much it costs, and again said we need to use the vaccine. As it turns out, my dad was born in 1922, and his siblings before that, and I suspect that they were some of the first to receive the typhoid vaccine in New York. Now we get to Mark Levine. So he's another student of Wade Hampton Frost. In 1934, he graduated. Wade Hampton Frost, he convinced him, he said, you need to get your doctorate in public health. So he did. He graduated, he went to Michigan, and after 2 years, Wade Hampton Frost contacted him and talked to Tom Perrin, who was the Commissioner of Health of New York State. By the way, also the 1937 APHA president. All right, he recommended Frost, he goes, we need somebody at Roswell Park Memorial Institute to chair epidemiology. So he went, right? And there, he recruited Buffalo native and UB graduate in 1930, William Hensel, who stayed until 1947. Many of you know the mental Hensel test, published in 1959, is probably the most cited publication ever, and I used it in my dissertation, right? That's the William Hensel, right? And then Milt Terrace was recruited, and then he left in 1958 with his wife, Rena Lapousse, a psychiatric epidemiologist. We couldn't find any papers by here until later, when they moved in 1958 to Tulane in New Orleans. But in the 60s, she applied to become part of the American Epidemiologic Society, and they turned her down because she was a woman. And so then Saxon and Abe Lilienfeld and who's the other guy? Brian McMahon. They decided we're going to form the Society for Epidemiologic Research, which they did in 1967, right? Because of her. I guess that's the story. Dave Lilienfeld told me. So, but anyway, what Dr. Levine did is a standard admission questionnaire. He added tobacco and other health behaviors. He knew that and suspected that cancer was determined by environment and behavior. And so that data collection, which collected from 1939 to 1950, then resulted in unbelievable work by Levine. So this brings us to the new frontier. So 1945, with epidemiologists in place at Roswell and the Department of Hygiene and Preventive Medicine, many things were going to happen, right? So chronic disease, they said, well, gee, we think that, we have to do more about it. And the orthodox medical view, a novel perception that a different paradigm, that chronic disease had environmental and behavioral causes, right? And so Western New York was transformative during that time in epidemiology, right? The important institutions of this era, the epidemiologists they employed, and the achievements that they made are remarkable, right? So in the Chronic Disease Research Institute, so William T. Clark was interim chair during the war of the Department of Hygiene and Public Health. He passed it on to guess who? Archibald Dean. And Archibald Dean was aware of the novel developing paradigm of chronic disease, so he said, I'm going to recruit a bunch of people to this institute and a branch of the newly named Department of Preventive Medicine and Public Health. So it was a branch of our department, right? And he would focus on recruitment. Dr. Mara, who's, I saw his picture earlier, he was hired in 1960 to chair the department, and he was a steward of the department. But he founded the first master's degree in epidemiology, one of the first in the country in the 60s. And guess who were the first 2 graduates? Bob Wallace, who went on to, I think, become dean or chair at Iowa, and Phil Nasca, who then went on to work at the State Health Department. First 2 graduates, master's degree. Then the Erie County Health Department was formed in 1948. It quickly became the largest county health department in the country by the 1960s and did magnificent stuff. Roswell Park Memorial Institute under Mort Levine. So guess what he did? He and Milt Terrace, and then he recruited Saxon Graham and Abraham Lilienfeld, Warren Winkelstein. David Lilienfeld told me that Mort Levine convinced Lilienfeld to come because the chair of epidemiology at Hopkins wouldn't give him a raise. So he left and came, and then he got recruited back to Hopkins, as you all know, to become chair of epidemiology back at Hopkins in 1958 or something, I think it was. So anyway, so they said, well, we're going to improve the admission questionnaire that Mort Levine had started. They transformed it, and from 57 to 65, all patients admitted were interviewed upon admission, including diet, complete residential history, complete occupational history, which they coded according to the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, and all other factors, including history of all kinds of diseases and allergies and all kinds of stuff, right? And the other thing is that the interviewer nor the patient knew the diagnosis. It was on admission, and the interviewer did not know the chief complaint. And so that was key. So this novel system was one of the first in the country, and it produced a treasure trove. I think the most telling data set for cancer epidemiology ever. And I think if you looked at the publications that have come out of it, thousands and thousands, it's unbelievable what they did, right? And this was Roswell in 1950s. Do you remember the side, anybody remember the side entrance? There used to be a duck pond there with ducks. I remember my grandmother was sent to Roswell. We went to pick her up when I was a kid, and we went and waited in the lobby, and there were the ducks in the pond. Anyway, but these are pictures. This is obviously Warren Winkelstein, a little bit later age, Abe Lilienfeld. Great picture of Saxon. And this is Mort Levine. It's the only picture we could find. We looked at it in the Library of Congress, anywhere. We tried to find, it's the only picture we could find of Mort Levine. But he was a pretty cool guy. And then APHA is hosted again. And it's unbelievable, right? I never knew this. In 1954, Milt Terrace hosted the meeting. And so, I mean, it talks about a school of public health. How many schools of public health hosted a national APHA meeting? This many times? None, I suspect. Anyway, greetings from the Director General. It's the only thing we could find on this meeting. And so I suspect if we go to the APHA, which maybe one of the students could go to the APHA treasure trove, pull up all the information on these meetings that happened in Buffalo. But this was his greeting. Back to Mort Levine. So now what I'm going to do is tell you about these seminal leaders in epidemiology at the time, what they did. Many of you, anyway, but he published Epidemiologic Features of Cancer, 1948. And this was a paper, by the way, at the Centennial Symposium for the medical school. And he first described some of the features and why we could study it better and look for preventive ways, etc. Then his famous study, Cancer and Tobacco Smoking in Pulmonary Heart, 1950, published with other papers in the American Medical Association. By the way, Mort Levine, the editor, they weren't going to publish it. He talked to the editor, he convinced them to publish all 3 papers. He said, this is really important, you need to publish it, Mort Levine, right? And so that was the first case control study that looked at smoking and lung cancer, showing dose-response relationships, right? So that was just one of the things, right? He was the commissioner on chronic illness, the director from 50 to 54, which was the prelim, excuse me, to the National Health Survey. Can you imagine? Just dropped my clicker. So, excuse me. Then the occurrence of lung cancer in man, which he described more details, but guess what? He talked about what proportion of lung cancer was related to smoking. He was the very first to talk about and describe and the population attributable risk, also known as the etiologic fraction. Wow, right? Then Abe Lilienfeld, so he's hired in 54, and he actually was founding chairman of the new Department of Statistics and Biologic Research, which is a sub-department of Epi at Roswell. Before departing, he made several critical things. He was the first to look at epilepsy, cerebral palsy, epidemiology. He was the first to look at the age distribution of female breast and genital cancers. And he found they did logarithmic things of the age distribution, and then they found this, they call it Clemenson's hook, which indicated that there, at menopause something happened and estrogen was related to these cancers. Very first description of that. Age distribution, so that was that. Emotional and other selected characteristics of cigarette smokers and non-smokers. I think he did this with Saxon. Again, saying that the behavior and the way people smoke is involved, right? And then the epidemiologic method in cancer research in 1958, where he proposed epidemiologic approaches to study cancer. This was all at Roswell by Abel Leinfeld. And then this is around the time, shortly after that, this is the Vena family in 1955. Okay? And these are my grandparents. And this guy right here is my big brother, Vic, who's in the audience. Hey, Vic. And there's the twins. I'm one of the twins. Can you guess which one is me? We'll talk about it later. So these are the folks in the 1920s, my dad, my uncle, they went to all graduates of St. Bonaventure, by the way. And they were vaccinated, right, in that 1930s. Now, when we were in Olean, one of the great things that we wanted to do was go to Crystal Beach. I mean, you remember that? Oh, that was so great, man. But one thing we had to do to get there was drive through Buffalo. And this was the scene, actually, on the Skyway of Buffalo. And can you imagine people living all around this? Open burning of refuse, and just that was the smoke coming out. The worst pollution like it is now in maybe some parts of the world. But I drove through that as a kid, and I remembered it, and I said, wow. Even in high school, I wrote a paper on air pollution and health effects. And so it was like, oh, wow. So this actual report was I dug out when I was doing my dissertation, had all the data from 1960 through 63, the first ever quantitative measures of air pollution in the country using high volume samplers at 32 stations, done by Warren Winkelstein and his team at the Chronic Disease Research Institute in the Erie County Department of Health, right? Pretty cool. Warren had appointments as a district health officer, director of the Division of Communicable Disease Control, but he also had appointments at the Chronic Disease Research Institute and Roswell Park, all three places. So he used that to his great advantage. He did incredibly innovative work. He was one of the first to look at pregnancy, artificial menopause, among women with coronary artery disease. And he was one of the first to hypothesize that there were endocrine changes in menopause and estrogen related to coronary artery disease. One of the first, right? The first. And he also looked at the 1954 polio, back to polio. The vaccine field trials were done in Erie County, New York, in Buffalo. And he published with Saxon the paper that looked at psychosocial factors and why people would get vaccinated, etc. And its first foray into the spatial stratification of data, which he would use for his air pollution studies. Phenomenal work, right? And the Buffalo blood pressure study in 1963, random sample of the wards in Buffalo and looked at blood pressure, right? And randomly sampled households and measured everybody in the household. And then later on, we acquired the data from Dr. Winkelstein. I found his paper in a file cabinet in the department. I went to Marines, I said, look at this. You know about this? He goes, no. He called up Warren Winkelstein. He sent all the data, and then it's been used for folks in our department, including a couple of dissertations. Karen's here, Faulkner, Joan Dorn. But anyway, the Erie County Respiratory Function Study done in 1962 with that treasure trove of data on measured, and then he compared it to lung function throughout the district, right? And those data, which have held up all this time, were the basis for the clean air standards. Now Saxon. Many of you know of Saxon's later work and all the work he did when we worked with him. But when he was a young professor, and first at Roswell, he was really interested in the social determinants of cancer and diet, etc. But in one of his first papers in 1956, looked at SES, illness and use of medical services using Butler County, Pennsylvania data. He was showed that socioeconomic status and the medical care system were intimately related, right? And he continued to look at SES distribution of cancer at various sites, which led him, 1960, which led him to hypothesize that ethnicity and SES were related to diet, which were related to cancer, and genetic studies of cancer, again with Abe Lilienfeld. And then dietary and purgation factors, comprehensive survey series, and looking at ingestion of products, including foodstuffs, alcohol, purgatives in relation to cancer. So these were very early works, and people didn't believe it, right? That the diet was related to cancer. But then in 1968, he publishes this fantastic paper on smoking behavior and puffing, and then they measured the tar and showed that your puffing pattern is related to how much dose you get, etc. Fascinating. And then he did a study on smoking withdrawal and risk of lung cancer, the very first with Morton Levine, that demonstrated that the risk reduction and length of cessation were directly proportional to that, also that was true for smokers regardless of the duration. So if you quit, your risk went down. And that was the flip side of the dose-response relationship that was a real argument against the tobacco industry, right? Alimentary factors in gastric cancer, and then this one was a very key paper in 1972 with Dr. Marvin Schneiderman, who was at NCI, talking about how cancer could be prevented, and he talked about the etiologic chain, that anywhere if you broke the chain, including people's behavior, you could prevent the cancer. It's like, wow, this was really transformative, that people, that was related to environment and behavior, and that you could break the chain along its way. So in your lookbook, right, there's a list of the first. I'm not going to read through these, but it's just astounding what was done in the era, in those eras. So now we're going to get to another era, okay? And this is 1975. That's my graduation picture from St. Bonaventure, which I attended, a BS in biology. I had to take 9 credits of theology and 9 credits of philosophy in all my biology classes. And then just imagine, it was the environmental movement, public health legislation, Vietnam War. This is some of the great music that came out at the time. But no PC, no internet, no email, no cell phone. This was like you studied books and you wrote, this kind of stuff. Right. In 1976, the doctoral program in epidemiology. How am I doing on time, by the way? All right. Am I way over? No. Fine. Okay. So the doctoral program, Dr. Graham was awarded a T32 training program in cancer prevention and control. And Dr. Greg Wilkinson, Joe Vanya, the first epidemiology course I got. At the end of the semester, he said, "I'm glad you guys read the textbook." And anyway, Kurt Metlin joined the group later. And the program continued for 30 years. Jim Marshall, is he here? Jim took over as the training program when Saxon retired, and then when you went off to Arizona, I took over for a while. But anyway, I was one of the first students of the program, right? And then in 1978, I was assigned offices in the Crest building and coded data for my dissertation. By the way, had lifetime residential histories, which I could put on census tract maps, calculate the air pollution, etc., right? And occupational history and detailed smoking data. Right? So I had to code all that data from the residential histories. And then I acquired the air pollution data from Dr. Winkelstein. Sax says, "Well, why don't you just call him up?" I said, "I'm going to call it Dean of the School of Public Health at Berkeley." He goes, "Yeah, why not?" You know, that kind of thing. So anyway, in April, spring fever hits, and Art Michaelek and John Aquavella, we're going in the basement, coming up. I said, "Gee, I need a girlfriend for the summer. This is ridiculous." Right? And so Aquavella comes back and he says, "Oh, there's my Diane, she's in nursing school. I just met this really nice girl. You got to meet her." I said, "Okay, set up a date." So it took like weeks and weeks. I said, What's going on? Let's get together." He says, "No, we're busy." I said, "Okay, give me your number." And then go back to Diane. "No, we can't give you her number." I'm like, "Why? Ask her." So they asked Sylvia. And I got the number, and this was... You can see why I fell in love immediately. So this is one of my first dates at Lecturers State Park, 1978. Yeah, So in 1978, we got called to the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations in downtown Buffalo. There was a group getting together. And they said, we're forming a COSH group. Eula Bingham, who was OSHA director at the time, was putting money out for unions to organize for health and safety and health reasons, prevention. So we went to the meeting, and I met union reps from the Buffalo municipal workers and the United Auto Workers who suspected excess cancer, and they came to me and said, okay. So they organized the COSH, and this is their current website. They're still in existence, Western New York Council on Occupational Safety and Health on Main Street in the old Trico building. And the same year, public health emergencies declared in Niagara Falls, New York at Love Canal, September 1978. And at that time, what happened was Hooker Chemical, all their chemical waste for 30, 40 years, they dumped into the Love Canal. Then they covered it over with dirt, sold it to the school system. They built a school on top and houses around it. And it turned into an environmental disaster, which many of you may know. Maybe the students don't. So in 1978, George Carlo and I, we said, we should do something. We got to find funding. These unions want us to do studies. So we talked to Harry Soltz, who was, I think we just took an epidemiology course from Harry Soltz, and we said, Harry, what do you think? He goes, well, there's this funding program at the state called the Health Research Council. Let's apply for grants. I'll be PI, et cetera. So we wrote the grants, sent them in. We got funded, right? 47,000 was one. The other one was 25,000. And then we went to the city. We negotiated with the mayor, the unions. Everybody was supportive of this, and they said, yeah, we'll let you through the Special Projects Administration hire clerks. So we hired four or five clerks, and we got going, collecting the data. Went to the Civil Service Commission, we started abstracting all the records. The union data was, for the UAW, was not very good, so we said, well, we'll look at the deaths over 10 years. And so I'll tell you more about that in a second. So 1980 comes along. I defended my dissertation in March 1980. I married Sylvia in May of 1980. And then our first couple of weeks in marriage, and then I went off to and she's like, I'm glad you're going. And went off to the Society for Epidemiologic Research to present my dissertation. I got it accepted, right? And it was a plenary talk. And back then, all the talks were plenary. SCR was really small. So this is the actual program, which I say, believe it or not. And this is where I'm presenting, right? I walk into the auditorium. It's bigger than this. It goes way up. It's filled with people. And sitting in front is Saxon Graham, Carl Scheid, who was like the world's expert on air pollution. I said, holy crap, what am I going to do? I was like shaky, and but I did have my slides in the carousel. I presented, and then at the end, they said, any questions? No one, not a soul. There were several hundred people there asked a question, because I think if they asked me a question, I probably would have fainted. I was 26 years old. I was like, oh my God, I was so scared. But anyway, that summer I got back to Buffalo. This is a really funny story, a little sidebar. I was with John Wilson, and he was in the summer program in Minnesota. And because I was on my own dime to the meeting, because I was working on these studies, I had a cheap airfare. You leave Saturday morning, so the meeting ended on Friday. He said, oh, you can sleep in my dorm room. I slept on the floor. But he said, let's go to a Cleveland Indians, Minnesota Twins game. We went 14 innings, and the buses wouldn't leave till the game was over. It got out at 2 a.m. or something. I had to go downtown to the dorm room, slept for an hour on the floor, got up and had to take the shuttle out to the airport, out by the stadium. I get off the plane, and Sylvia's all dialed up. Oh, welcome back, honey. And I'm like, oh. She goes, what happened to you? So anyway. So that summer, 1980, I was named to the UB Task Force on Love Canal in a cooperative agreement with CDC. We spent all summer, we rented a hotel up there, we spent all summer working on the protocols. Ken Rogers picked a control group, the Health Services Research Program in our department. Control group in Cheektowaga. We had all the protocols in place. Then Jimmy Carter lost the election to Reagan, and they ran out of money, no additional money was funded. Again, the community got screwed again, and nothing was ever done after that. Well, anyway, that's a long story. So then came Dr. Graham. So the funding from these studies ended. I was making $16,000 a year. And then I got promoted to assistant professor, and I made $22,000 a year. And, but this was it. It was great. Dr. Graham came, he brought Jim and the study team, and he had the social epidemiology cancer grant, 81 to 86, 6 cancer sites, case control study. I was part of the team. I was like, wow, this is super fantastic. This is a later picture in 1980, but there's Carl, and Jean is there, and there's Saxon and Maurizio, and Bob O'Shea, and there's Joe Fong, my other brother. So anyway, I'd be remiss not to mention that at the same time, Michael Cummings was recruited to Roswell in 1981 to join the staff that was chair of the Department of Health Behavior in 1999, 81 to 99. I guess he ran the health behavior program there, tobacco cessation program. And then he was a great partner through the years with the training grant and hiring students and, et cetera. And I think maybe a lot of us in the room were part of those training programs, either as a doctoral postdoc. And the other guy I want to mention is Art Michaelek, who we shared offices and did lots of stuff together, grad school. He became director of education and then dean and vice president. So fantastic work. We don't have time to go over all this stuff, but I mean, just fantastic. Here's my dissertation, the leading paper at AJE in 1982 on air pollution as a risk factor in lung cancer. And most people didn't believe it, but this table shows age stratified but then adjusted, and then this thing called index of synergy developed by Ken Rothman, which showed that there was interaction and synergistic effects of combinations of exposure of air pollution, an indication of a slight increase in risk, especially younger people, for air pollution. They're like, what? Right? And so this was my dissertation. This and all the other tables, the individual cells, Maya gave me this Texas Instrument calculator that was programmable. I had to enter every single cell, and then it would come up. It was really cool. It would calculate the mental Hensel adjusted, right, and the significance and stuff like that. So I had to do that. There was no PC at that time, right? But here and behold, in 2014, it only took 32 years, but it's a replication from the American Cancer Society cohort study that found the same thing, basically. And they didn't reference my paper. It was too old. So this is some of the other data from RPCI, 57 to 65. Tim Byers and I. This is another thing about Roswell. I found out that all the lung cancers for that same time period, that there was a cabinet with little cards that gave the histologic type of every single lung cancer. I said, oh my God. So I went over and spent hours here and there to just collect the data. So we were some of the first to look at histologic type by smoking, by diet, by all kinds of other. We also looked at by occupation. So we published some papers. And then the other thing is they did complete history on allergy. And a medical student worked with me. So we looked at the relationship between allergy and cancer. Except for the hematopoietic cancers, every single cancer had an inverse association with allergy in the Roswell Park data set. And the entire data set was like, how many? 60,000 or something like that? I don't know. It's huge, right? So anyway, that was a cool paper. And then Dr. Graham came back from a meeting and said, hey, there was a paper presented on activity colon cancer. Can you study that? I said, okay, I'll try. And so we had lifetime occupational histories, remember, coded to the DOT. I was working with Bob Barnes in the city study, and he says, he's an industrial engineer. I says, do you have any idea how we could get activity? He goes, oh, that's easy. The U.S. Department of Labor has rated every single job in the Dictionary of Occupational Title by 5 levels of physical activity. Whether you walk, lift. I said, holy crap, that's great. So we developed an index, had lifetime occupational histories on all the colon cancers, and picked all the colon cancer cases, picked controls, and we looked at it. And guess what? Dose-response relationship with the number of work years in sedentary jobs, the proportion of your work years you're in sedentary jobs, and the proportion of life. Maria Zalesny helped me with this, as she was really cool to work with, right? And this is the National Enquirer, 1986. Dallas, who shot JR, right? Right? And then On page 35, warning, desk jobs increase colon cancer risk. That's my study. How many of you have National Enquirer in your seat? And what's really cool is underneath a picture of people get married on roller skates. And something else about a teddy bear collection. Do you have the biggest teddy bear collection? You can win $200. So I don't have time to go through all the city worker stuff, but it was really magnificent. The cohort was 12,000 workers from 1950 to 1979. We followed them all. I think we had to get death certificates from like 40 states or something like that. So we looked at male workers, female workers, police officers, and firefighters. And then we, later, a medical student worked with me, looked at sewage plant workers, which was really interesting, because you think at a sewage plant, the stuff that contaminants that come out. And then Sandy Petralia looked at the women in the public sector and cancer mortality, just looking at cancer. And actually, this was the first study of public sector women workers ever done. And then the police officers, in that paper, we did direct adjusted rates, looking at police officers compared to other municipal workers. And we found, among other things, increased risk for suicide. Even though the SMR overall was 1, firefighters and other workers, if you're employed, you have a low risk of suicide, basically. And so we said, wow. So we ended up doing a whole bunch of studies with John Violante and suicide. Beth Moscato was here. Poor Beth, we did a psychological autopsy on all the external causes in the cohort. We sent her to the morgue to collect data. Anyway, so we published some papers on that. And then we followed the cohort up to 1990, and then we followed the cohort again up to 2005. So it's the longest running police cohort in the country. And as you know, that the police study, we got a small grant from the Institute of Mental Health, John Violante and I, to do a pilot study of 100 randomly selected. By the way, the city was great. They allowed, the union was supportive, the commissioner of police, I think with John Violante over the years met with 4 or 5 commissioners of police. They were really supportive. They allowed the police to come to our clinic on their time, when they're on shift, which was really phenomenal. So we had 100, we got randomly selected 100 to come in for very detailed, based on Women's Health Initiative and all the stuff that we learned, PTSD, IMT of their carotids, all kinds of medical, drew their blood, all this kind of stuff. It takes like 2-3 hours, right? Something like that. We gave the police officers this little police car, which I have one in my office, a little metal police car with a badge and stuff. They loved that, right? Guess what the response rate was? Highest of any study I've ever done. 100%. Of 100 police officers came in and did the study, right? And that was the start of, with that pilot data, then John's on his what, third RO1 studying the cohort. Anyway. Then this one, the mortality in the automobile engine plant. The Chevy Tonawanda engine plant at the time, we looked at mortality over 10 years. There were 3 units. There was a foundry, a forge, and an engine plant. The foundry, I took a tour when I was a grad student. It was the most horrendous place I've ever been in, right? Where there was just, silica molds, and dust would fly in the air, and people working there, smoking cigarettes while they work. I said to the union guy, what are you doing smoking on the job in this environment? He goes, oh, the union, we negotiated that as a benefit a few years ago. Holy cow. But anyway, what we found was really high mortality for digestive cancers in the machining plant. The foundry suggested really high mortality, especially among African Americans. The mean, well, anyway, I don't have to tell you the findings, but before we published the paper, I said, well, we got to release this to the union reps, and so I got a fact sheet. I had my little overhead. This is before slides. I had my overhead projector with overheads, and I called up Tom Fricano, the regional director of UAW. I said, geez, I'd like to present this to your workers. He said, okay, come out to the executive inn. I said, okay. So I went to the executive inn, and they had a lunch table set up. I walk in, the guys are there, they're drinking beer. I set up with my projector, I start giving the overheads. This is how many deaths occurred. And then who walks in with lunch but the Playboy bunnies? Oh my God. It was the most unbelievable experience of my life. I am serious. And we were talking about it, and they said, oh, well, But anyway, so something really good came out of this study, and then the GMUAW Advisory Council, a couple years after that, put an RFA out for detailed cohort studies of the machining factories. And actually it was a guy at Harvard who used this book. But anyway, they did it, and they basically replicated some of the stuff we found in this PMR study, this 10-year study, where they're especially at risk for digestive cancer. So the machining fluids you basically don't inhale, you ingest, right? So anyway, that's a little story there. Then comes 1985 and 86, and Dr. Graham gets the renewal of the program, and this is us on the steps, program social. Andrew Kramer, is he here? There's Andrew. He was part of the team that we remember the site visit. Yeah, it was tough. I think initially scored, and then Dr. Graham, really pushed for it. He got funded. Anyway, long story. So then in 1986, I was called up to Saxon's office twice. I said, oh my God, he calls me up. He goes, hey, Veens, come to my office right away. I'm like, oh God, what did I do? Right? I get up there, he goes, sit in that chair. I'm sitting in the chair like this. He pulls out a camera, takes my picture. I said, what? He goes, okay, what else you want to say? That's it. I go, okay. So then later in the early December, hey, Veens, come up to my office right away. I got to talk to you. I go, okay. I go and sit down. And he has a wrapped package, brown paper. He goes, give this to Sylvia. It's a present for her. I said, what? And believe it or not, Saxon painted my portrait. Gave it to Sylvia as a gift. In the midst of all this, program grant, all this stuff, he's president of SCR, all this stuff, he's taking the time to paint and do other stuff. Like the guy's a Renaissance man, right? I mean, this hangs in our bedroom. You can see the date, S. Graham, 86. Phenomenal, right? What a guy. So in my new cancer program grant was to develop measures to study past exposure to electromagnetic fields. You say, what? That's when EMF and childhood cancer, that was coming out. EMF and breast cancer was suspected. There were papers out. And Saxon said, I think we need to measure this. Can you imagine? They're like, okay, well, let's see. Well, we found out that electric blankets have really high magnetic field, the older ones. And you put them on your body and you're like getting zapped with electromagnetic waves, right? And so he also said we had to measure physical activity because, again, the colon cancer stuff, we need to measure leisure time, occupational physical activity, and then also lifetime occupational history, so for case control studies. So what I developed was this manual for occupational history taking because we wanted to make sure they were good. And we trained the nurses, we developed a manual, I had training sessions with the nurses who were interviewing the patients to take very detailed and make sure, so if they said inspector, it couldn't be just inspector. What kind of inspector? What did you do? Probe them to get very specific occupational titles, which we then coded. And Pauline Mendola is here, I think. Where's Pauline? Pauline, you were working you helped code some of those data, right? I remember working, I said, God, she's brilliant. She's got to get her doctorate. And she ended up going on and getting her doctorate and is now established. She coded the data. Yeah, and it was very complicated to take occupational histories and code, identify them and code them into these things. It was a tedious job. Dr. Graham at the time had the vision to collect blood on all participants, and phlebotomists were sent to the home, and we got 70 to 75% participation in both cancer patients and controls, people without the cancer, right? Which was phenomenal. I think one of the first time he wanted to look at micronutrients in blood and how it was related to cancer. And so then in 1986-87, he's president of SCR. And of course, he gives this paper at presidential remark at SCR in Amherst in 1987. And what does he talk about? Not science. He talks about enhancing creativity in epidemiology. I think it's often, not really looked at often or considered, but it's a phenomenal paper. And what did he say? Creative people have energy, dedication, enthusiasm. But he also said they have to be involved in mentoring and being mentored. Not afraid to make errors. You can't be afraid to make mistakes. Range far and wide, take chances. You're less competitive, are not too critical. You strive to learn. Phenomenal, right advice. So I put this note on top because I wanted to briefly mention that we were with Maurizio and Lisa. We're in their home around Christmas time, having dinner. And then Maurizio says, oh, we're going to Italy, you know, end of January, and blah, blah, blah. Why don't you come with us? Sylvia and I look, and we had the 3 little kids, and we're like, what? So, okay, let's go. And so, yeah, I'm going to a cancer center in Milan, and Franco Barino wants you to, you know, talk on this physical activity cancer stuff. I okay. So in 3 weeks, we got our passport. It wouldn't happen now, right? Yeah, 3 weeks, we got our passport, got our air tickets, and we went with them to Milan. And I'm sitting in Franco Barino. We stayed at his apartment in Milan. We gave a paper. We had a good time. And I get a call from Jo Marie Rizzo at the time, and she says, I've been trying to track you down. She says, we just got a call from the Society for Epidemiologic Research, and they want us to host, they accepted your proposal to host the SER meeting in 1991. Phenomenal, right? So I got that news, Franco Barino ended up coming and speaking at the symposium for Dr. Graham's retirement in 1991. He stayed at our house. We gave him a return favor. So here's a international society, the very first International Society for Environmental meeting in 1989 in Brookhaven. And I got accepted to present on the early cancer study, bladder cancer, looking at chlorinated drinking water diet, bladder cancer, case control study. So I presented it at the meeting. The very next paper was this PCBs in Lake Michigan birth size. I was like, wow, what's that? I said, well, Lake Ontario has. So this is where, talked to these guys, I said, we should do the same study in Western New York and Lake Ontario. We ended up publishing about 4 or 5 papers on the bladder cancer stuff. I'll get back to the other one in a second. And so then I got called by Frank Spicer and say, look, we want you to be part of an environmental health agenda workshop in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1991. I said, fantastic, I'm there, right? And so got sent there, and we had full day workshops. We're talking about stuff. There's a paper that came out detailing what we should be doing with environmental health in the 90s. And here's some of the people who were there. This is a partial list. John Vena, social and preventive medicine. But look at the top, Peter Shields, Laboratory of Human Carcinogenesis. Peter. And so Peter, just at that time, and part of the readings for the workshop are this environmental causes of cancer, and Peter Shields and Kurt Harris. So they're very famous guys at NCI, right? And Peter also published in JAMA, Molecular Epidemiology and Genetics of Environmental Cancer. And so at the end of the sessions, we're at these workshops, and we're like, oh God, we need a beer. So we go to the bar, and so Peter and I start talking, exchanging ideas and stuff. We hit it off. I'm like, he's a great guy. We start talking. And then I started telling him, I said, you know, Saxon, we have stored samples of blood on all of our cancer cases and controls. I says, Peter, I says, we saved, I think it was the plugs or something, that Linda Duffy, who helped process the samples and stuff, saved everything. He says, we have some saved samples. We sent them off to get measured for the nutrients. And I says, can you do it? We just developed last week the method to extract and polymerize DNA and get big amounts of it from a very small amount. It was like, wow. So we came back to the group. I talked to Joe. I was like, Joe, I can't believe it. Peter Shields, we got to link up with this guy. Now we've had a partnership with him ever since, right? Published how many hundreds of papers with Peter. And I just want to highlight 2 that started it. And Chris Ambrosoni and Kirsten, those 2 were some of the first ever to look at gene-environment interaction in breast cancer. And Christine showed that if you smoke cigarettes and you have a genetic polymorphism and N-acetyltransferase 2, you have increased risk for breast cancer. And Kirsten looked at blood levels of PCBs, which I'll talk about, a biomarker of your exposure to these persistent pollutants, and the polymorphism that metabolize it. But if you have the polymorphism and high exposure in your blood, you have an increased risk for breast cancer. If you don't have either, by the way, you don't have increased risk, right? Which is incredible, right? So these are some of the first findings that like flip things on their head about saying that it's not just an environment, but it's an environment and genetics. And then some of the other stuff from occupational history quickly, premenopausal breast cancer and polycyclic aromatic carbons and benzene, employment and managerial and professional, and then also lifetime physical activity of breast cancer. Again, Joan Dorn with some of the data on occupation and leisure time activity that we looked at with breast cancer. And then with electromagnetic fields, we looked at risk of premenopausal and postmenopausal breast cancer. And Jim helped me with thinking through some of the thinking on this stuff, because we got letters to the editor back, etc. And there was a slight suggestion of an increase, but nothing. So it kind of laid some of the concerns about EMF with breast cancer. And Larry Glucose looked at congenital defects in electric bed heating, and we didn't find anything there. But we also wanted to know, well, who's getting exposed? So Larry did a study of electromagnetic density in urban neighborhoods. Then comes the SER in 1991, which was a fantastic meeting, and Dr. Graham's retirement reception was before that, a pre-conference on nutritional epidemiology, and it was a great success. So now a little bit about the legacy. So after that meeting in 1989, I started designing a study, a cohort study, with the help of Jermaine Lewis, and we wanted to send out surveys to sportsmen who ate out of Lake Ontario. So, cut to the chase, we sent two grants into NIH, they didn't get funded. They said, well, we don't believe we can do it. So we did a pilot study over summer with a medical student, sending out surveys. We got 50-60% response, we sent it in. Oh, it's not important, PCB levels are going down. I said, oh God. But just as we developed all this, had the pilot data, Great Lakes Protection Fund came out with an RFA. We submitted, we got funded. We sent the questionnaires out, established the cohort. Once we had the cohort established, the Great Lakes Health Effects Program came out, CDC, with their RFA. We submitted it, and we had the cohort together, right? And so we spent 10 years on all these studies. I can't, obviously 2 slides can't cover 10 years of research, but we developed standardized methods for PCB analysis. E.B. Greiserstein, she, by the way, had her little startup company at 2211 Main Street in the back building. When I was there, she showed me all the stuff, et cetera. But then TRC and Jim Olson and others created the methods. We used that. We had then designed a prospective pregnancy study, and then we measured the PCBs in the blood. And Michael Bloom and Enrique and Jermaine looked at the changes in maternal serum over pregnancy, the first time that was ever done. The prospective pregnancy study showed that the PCB serum concentrations, certain types, increase the time to pregnancy, so we're endocrine disruptors. Pauline looked at birth defects in the cohort using the histories we had, as well as the birth defects registry. And by the way, the questionnaire was designed using food frequency methods that we all learned through Dr. Graham, right? That we could measure how much people ate fish out of what body of water, et cetera, using the standardized procedures. We did a reliability study. Dr. Graham told us, well, we have to look at our methods and how can we look and make sure they're valid. So we did a reliability study and again, a prospective pregnancy study. And then we had bank samples, and New York State contacted me and said, gee, do you have any samples? Can you look at, we want to look at these emerging pollutants. And they were polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants that bioaccumulate, and perfluoroalkyls, PFAS, which are the Scotch Guard, Stain Guard, et cetera. Those are now, these are newly emerging. So we said, yeah, we'll send it in. So they helped develop the methods using our biological samples. And then they were like one of the world experts in the labs. Then Matt Bonner, Matt was here, I think I saw him walk in. Where are you, Matt? There you are. Took over the Angler study when I left, and we did some further stuff. He followed them through the cancer registry. And here's a couple paper where we're looking at cancer. By the way, lower risk of cancer for colon cancer. And there was some suggestion of an increase with chemicals, but a protective effect of the omega-3. So there's a balance in the mix that you get from these Lake Ontario fish. And then, of course, other things that we can talk about. The Women's Health Initiative, I remember the craziness of putting that proposal in, but then we got it, and then we said, oh my God, we have to do it, right? But anyway, Gene has been super in terms of leading the effort. And then all of us were involved with the application, and Joe was the PI with Howard Blaine, clinical medical epidemiology. These are case control studies of cancers, but also cardiovascular disease. And of course, we got blood samples and other. One thing that I insisted on, and we argued a lot about it, but I said we have to get lifetime residential histories. And it was really great that we did. 1995, this is a note from Saxon, where I missed him a lot, so I would go visit him and spend time with him at his home. And you know, he just was so thoughtful. He wrote this note and said, thanks for the goodies. And then, first you were my student, then a faculty member, and now a full professor, wow. But I know we'll see other fine accomplishments from you, John. You're a good guy. Phenomenal. You know, that's the way he was. That's how he treated you. You know, here is a young guy in his research program, and he said, I'm looking to you to do this work for me, and he trusted you, right? And then this is how he taught, how he treated you. Then, of course, don't have time to go through all the sesquicentennial celebrations that we have, but it was phenomenal. So then after the sesqui, we said, I called up Moises Flo and said, Moises, you know, you guys published something on John Hopkins. How about if we do an anniversary issue for Buffalo? I said, oh yeah, sure. All of them have to be peer reviewed. So we sent all the papers in, whole journal issue, right? Phenomenal. A couple papers from the Angler study in there, and Joan published a paper on the follow-up of the Buffalo Health Study, 1996. And then this is a picture on Saxon's front lawn of people he invited over for a dinner, right? That's how Caroline and Saxon were. You know, stuff would happen, they'd invite you over and say, look, you know, let's get together. It was fantastic. So there's Mike and Paula Noe and John Aquavella, and there's Phil Nasca, Brenda Holly, this is Warren Winkelstein and his wife, Bob Wallace, Maurizio, Greg Wilkinson, Bob Warnicki, is that Warnicki? Of course, there's Caroline. And then I made some buzz through the slide that said that back in the 80s I would get these reprint requests from Poland, Behind the Iron Curtain, from Wisław Jadrukowski. And I would just like send the reprints off. And at the 1995 ISEE meeting in Amsterdam, Pauline was there, Sandy Petralia was presenting, etc. And we're in the audience, and a guy comes up to me, Professor Vena, I presume. It's Wisław Jadrukowski, the guy who for years was sending me reprint requests, right? So I said, I'm going on sabbatical in 1997, and I'll be in Europe. He said, okay, great. He invited me. I lectured at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, one of the oldest universities in the world. It's phenomenal. Then he said, can you help me with a conference? I said, sure. And Sylvia said, if you do another conference. So I said, sure, we'll organize it. But because we just had the sesquicentennial, I invited, you know, Phil, who was in Europe at the time doing some workshops or something. And Warren said, oh yeah, I'll be there. And they came and presented papers at this, and this is the publication of the proceedings. But while I was there, because of the work we had done and other things, is Wisław and the Jagiellonia gave me this medal. It's called the Krakow Jubileus Medal. It was on the occasion of the 600-year anniversary of their university. Wow. Right? And here's a note from Saxon, right? Hi, Beans. Sometimes Johnny, but anyway. Hi, Beans. I wanted to congratulate you on the honor from one of the oldest universities in the world. Good for you, Beans. I'm proud of you as always, Sax. Phenomenal, right? What a guy. And then I just want to briefly mention this, that kind of, it brings full circle, right? William Love Canal, the declaration of the disaster, working on the task force. And 20 years later, as part of the American Society Institute, we had a symposium on the 20-year anniversary talking about the history, lessons learned. I talked about the science and health ever since Love Canal. So did Jimmy Olsen, my buddy there, Jim, presented. And so that was published in the Buffalo Environmental Law Journal. And then in 2000, crazy again, another conference. I'm like, Anyway, we had the ISE 2000 meeting, and guess what the theme was? Environmental epidemiology in Pan America and the world, to commemorate the Pan American Exposition of 1901. It was the 100-year anniversary. And so we had people from South America. It supercharged the ISE South American chapter, etc. It was and here's all of us at Sax is there. Joe Fon, John Equivella, Greg Wilkinson. This is Frank Spicer, who invited me to the workshop, right? And he's the guy who did the nurses' health study, right? And of course, Warren was there as well. This is the first EPI meeting with an internet cafe, and we used PowerPoint. We insisted everybody use PowerPoint, no overheads. And they had to bring it on the little, remember those little floppy disks? And then, in 1999, we had workshops the previous year with the geography department. How are we doing on time? Almost there. And did spatio-temporal, David, Mark, and others, we put together a grant. I was co-investigator, and we got this, there was just an RFA. Using GIS, I said, we have the lifetime histories on these breast cancer cases. And so we came up with this idea of geospatial lifelines, following people, and it got funded from NIH as a 4-year grant, and that supercharged all our work on GIS applications in cancer. So Matt Bonner developed, you got all the air pollution data, looked at air pollution and breast cancer, Jing Ni and air traffic emissions using these new GIS techniques. And then Jerry Bove took the bladder cancer paper that I had, and we used the residents, and he did further modeling of the actual byproducts in the drinking water related to both bladder cancer and rectal cancer, which showed very positive associations with certain segments of certain parts of the water system. So I'm coming to the conclusion. So we've traveled through time, but only up to the 150 years. The last 15 years, we run out of fuel. Sorry. But another call to action to you guys, and that's, there's 10 important qualities for action. And these are the 10, which I'll go over. Be value-driven. Values and purpose are their primary anchors. What's at stake? What matters? How do you get organized? The quality of being value-driven is necessary to rise above debate and take that social action, right? Connect to the world. You have, and the students here, you have at your fingertips the most information ever available. We have the cell phones, you can track people, you can develop apps, whatever. I mean, it's unbelievable what you can do now compared to years past. Here's Epidemiology and Virtue Ethics. Every student should read this by Weed and McCowan. These are the words that they describe as the values that you should hold. Honesty, self-effacement, integrity, fidelity to trust, excellence, and prudence. To me, that describes Saxon Graham. Quiet and solitude. You got to take time to contemplate, have introspection. How do you make a difference in the world? You got to be able to slow down and take that time. You got to have innovation planning. You got to build you can't sustain optimal performance at everything. You have to have a careful pace. Sylvia was always great in making sure that I kept that steady pace without too much hectic stuff, taking the time with for each other, taking vacations, whatever. Right? Contact with nature. With our friends who are here, we'd go to Niagara Falls and just flake out for a couple of days, listen to the roar of the falls. It's like, wow, does that renew your spirit or what? And human courage. We all make mistakes, and sometimes you really screw up. And challenge existing envelopes for exploration and experimentation. And many of you I know here have done that. But that takes courage to attempt to novel in the face of criticism. And Saxon was really good at that, right? He would try it. He would say, we have to do this, right? And keep pursuing the best option to change. Sometimes you got to adapt a little bit to things that may change things. And then other times there also be disappointments, losses, failures, mistakes, even tragedy in your life, right? And again, there's valuable lessons we can learn. When I was in graduate school, my second semester, I had a fire. It destroyed everything in the apartment. I had to start over. I was left with my underwear. But with family and friends, I came back to classes after a couple. I could have quit. That could have been it, right? But I didn't. And continue learning, fertilization of knowledge. Seek out kindred spirits, guys like Peter Shields at the meeting, right? Foster social intellectual interactions that build understanding. And create scenarios for the future. Gene, you have to dream big. You and the college have to dream big. You have to get the strategic plan. You have to work together. And don't be afraid to try things that are almost seems impossible. You can do it. But if you don't dream it, it won't happen. And so here are some of the other, in the literature, things that you should think about. What matters most? Quantifying epidemiology of consequence. Competencies for doctoral students. Implementation science. Epigenomics, it's not just the genes, right? Charting a future for epi-training. Transforming epidemiology for the 21st century, right? So there are challenges, but things that you can embrace. And okay, the EMF stuff said, okay, well, maybe you guys aren't important. But here's another example of something new. 5G wireless. So this is very high frequency. What are the potential health effects from 5G? It's going to be everywhere. It's going to blast us all, right? But what kind of subtle effects will it have? So this paper really is provocative in saying, we need to look at it. You as epidemiologists need to look at it. So those are just a few of the challenges. Team science, right? Here's a field guide. This is really fantastic. NIH came out with this. And it gives a guide of how to work in teams. And we can't do anything these days now without working in a team. So really, you got to look at this. And academic health centers and the evolution of the healthcare system. What does it say? Indeed, to survive, academic health centers must reconfigure and transform it rapidly and broadly in size, speed, value, and innovation. Like what? They have to do population health. Does that sound familiar? Like 100 years ago? When our medical school did that? And also, here's the Institute of Medicine, it's a little dark. 2016, we need collaboration between healthcare and public health. What, isn't that what they said 100 years ago? Isn't that what we did? Right? So we have to embrace it again. You have to go out and develop those partnerships to make it happen. The most productive, innovative teams were led by people who were task and relationship oriented. And Saxon was one of those guys. He was task and relationship oriented. You can tell, right? Those notes that he would write, ask how you were doing all the time. But then he also said, did you finish writing that proposal? Leaders set clear expectations. Past can be unclear. A scaffold to developing deeper trust. No secrets. Platform, communication, authorship criteria, career development. Best ever leader. Listened to me, recognized me, supported me without taking over, involved me in decisions, took time to explain rationale for decisions, and took care to maintain my self-esteem. Transformational leadership is hard work. You have to lead from the front. You can't expect people to do something you're not willing to do. I found that lesson along the way. You must take care of all, both professionally and personally. And must be willing to delegate, build consensus, provide transparent communication. Most of all, you have to listen. And Saxon listened. Even though I was a young whippersnapper kid, he would listen to me and say, oh yeah, I think, John, that's a good idea. Right? So this was taken when, I think it was the first Saxon Graham lecture. And so what will your legacy be? And all of those folks that I mentioned is that what most people said about them, right, after they were gone, was that they were a great mentor. Okay, that's the last slide. did the time machine work? And you have your lookbook, which gives some really good information, more in-depth text. Questions? No questions? Would you like the journey? Talk science all the time. You know, that one thing that strikes me is that, you know, along the way, you also have to be open and receptive to things that may happen. And a lot of the stuff that happened was just happened to be happenstance or just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But you have to be receptive to kind of accept or listening to what may happen. And so I think about it, and thinking over the past 30, 40 years, I'm like, I've just been truly blessed because a lot of this stuff happened. I would have never, I grew up in Ole, Indiana. I was a young kid that went to Buffalo. And like, what, how could all this stuff happen? And it's just phenomenal. So I think you just have to be open to it. Question, yeah, Mike. Yeah, so Mike is asking about writing it up and contributing to this. And so here's a 37-page fully referenced document. And we have all of the references. We have the original papers dating back to old times. And really, Charles Nation, who worked with me, did most of this. He was phenomenal. He was phenomenal. And so for each of the eras, we have detailed descriptions. So we're trying to find a place maybe where we can publish a book, also with all the pictures in the lookbook. And we have an archive for each of the eras, photos, different details, scanned documents. In the scanned documents, there's brochures and abstracts for conferences. New York State Health Department earlier instruments. We have, actually, when I was at the Crest building in the basement, I found, when I was extracting everything, I found original copies of all the instruments and I saved them. Now I scanned them and I'm going to give them to you as a gift. All of the instruments from Mark Levin and the 57 to 65, every single instrument has been scanned. And I use them for my dissertation, but it's phenomenal. These guys were so far ahead of their time. And these are just tremendous, in terms of what they documented, how they documented. So the 57, 65, and also there were some 66 revisions. There's some handwritten on the top. So we have all those, and there'll be a treasure trove for you guys. And I think Maya probably has all the original data as well still. Scanned photos, the Buffalo physician, and even the Buffalo Kenmore study. I think Tim Byers did some work on that, and Saxon was one of his studies, a random sample of people in Buffalo Kenmore, and those instruments are there. So, and then I just want to show you this. This is our family, our 3 kids. So this is Chris, and this is his wife Natalie, and she's pregnant there. And now this is little Baldwin, our new grandson. There's Chris and Natalie, and this is Caden and Claire, our grandchildren. This is Brian and there's Rebecca here. And then this is Elise and Eric, who she married last weekend. And here's the wedding picture. I think that's the last one. Oh, I said it. Talk about it later. So what do you think, left or right? On the grandpa or on the grandpa? Huh? On the left? No, I was on the right. I was sitting on my grandmother's lap. The one on the right was Tony, who now has a full head of hair. He got the hair gene. Vic and I got it. Okay. Questions? Come on. Carl?
So everything has a Buffalo connection. You just showed that. You moved on to South Carolina, to Georgia. Did they have the same connections?
Yeah, in a different way, but no, not like this. This is pretty special. You know, I mean, when Charles started digging up some of this stuff, you know, I was just like blown away, really. Take the list of first. That's just up to 1970 or something like that. That's phenomenal, right? The stuff that, I mean, it's just unprecedented, right? What they did, and they were the leaders, and many of them went on to. So on that picture, that was, I think is in the lookbook, is the folks at the Chronic Disease Research Institute. So that's Michelle Ibrahim. He went on to become Dean of School of Public Health at Chapel Hill. David Sackett, who became a McMaster in evidence-based medicine, all of that. Who else is there? Warren, who became Dean of School of Public Health at Berkeley. I mean, you just go on and on and on. I mean, these guys were just incredible. Yeah, Gary.
One quick question, John. I think your first year of teaching, you taught a course on occupational and environmental epidemiology, which I took and I greatly enjoyed.
Yeah.
But you took us through a tour of Bethlehem's field when it was...
Wow, that was the early day, yeah.
And like that was like walking through hell or something. I mean, it was just incredible.
Yeah.
And how did you get a connection to bring a bunch of graduate students into Bethlehem's field? I was so amazed that we even did that.
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Yeah, vividly, yeah.
How did it work?
So we just, I can't remember. I think we just called like the health and safety office or whatever. There's usually a physician or whatever. They had, you know, and I just said, look, I have graduate students in epidemiology and want to give a tour. Okay, bring in. They put us through. Yeah, we went through the blast furnace, all that stuff. Yeah.
I appreciate your both.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I've been teaching it for 40 years. So I'm still doing it. But yeah, it would change. And I think when I taught it at SPM, I taught environmental and occupational epi first. And then the students would complain, that's too much stuff. So then I taught two separate courses, and of course expanded them. Occupational health is so different than environmental. Almost now you have to have two separate courses. But yeah, it was challenging. Yeah. Yes?
Just a comment, I was recently on faculty a few months ago, and I found this incredibly fascinating and such pride for the history. I think it's also been fascinating to hear it all because so much of what the department has been doing recently really continues this legacy of Dr. Ferdinand's leadership, the infectious disease work, the nutrition work, the cancer work. I mean, it's just fascinating to see kind of that culmination of so much history continuing under Joe.
Yeah.
So it was tremendous.
I think it's true.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. The other thing I want to stress is the partnership with Roswell Park. I mean, and our department has been so phenomenal. From the very beginning, you see those things that happen between social and preventive medicine and Roswell. And the cancer training grant, by the way, Dr. Graham had was at Roswell. It wasn't at UB. And it continued that way. And that partnership with Mike Cummings and the trainees that would be training there. And Art Michaelek, and the stuff that he did in continuing the training and education program. I mean, it's really incredible, and the cross-fertilization work that we would do. I would be on there, and I remember at the site, one of the site visits for the Comprehensive Cancer Center, and they reviewed, et cetera, and I remember there was all excitement and a buzz, and that was that, I think it was at that time that they said that, well, we're recruiting Jim Marshall back to Roswell, and I said, wow, that's phenomenal. What year did you leave, Jim?
Well, I came back in 2002.
Yeah, when did you leave, though?
I left in 96, and then I came back, I missed the weather.
96. Yeah, so phenomenal. And also, one thing I wanted to add, Art Goshen is in the front here, is I distinctly remember that he was the fastest overhead person I ever knew in my life. As I took his course in health policy at SPM, and he taught that course, and I haven't had the book for a long while, but I learned a great deal from him about health systems, etc. but I remember you as a professor actually, so that's really great you're here. Any other questions? Well, certainly happy to, if you email me. Yeah, here's the picture, you got it up. Okay, so I already told you which one's me. It's on the right. And my grandmother, Carmela. Yeah, I'm just like, oh, it's so nice to be with my grandmother. But anyway, story about her is that and when we were in Italy with Maurizio, we got their wedding certificate in the old town, Castelvetta dei Sulcolori in the mountains. There was a whole page that gave listed the wedding party and what they did and all this kind of stuff. And then they had the occupation of the bride and the groom. And the groom, of course, he was a shoemaker, so it's a cobbler or whatever. And at her, it said peasant farmer. And we had a big garden behind the house where I grew up. I grew up 2 doors away from my grandmother. But she would yell, and we would be little kids, and she needed help in the garden, and she'd call out, Johnny, you come, okay. And so I'd go help her. But for years and years, until I got older and went to Italy, I thought she was saying Johnny, like Saxon called me Johnny, but it was Johnnny. But it wasn't. It was Gianni, Gianni, short for Giovanni, which is the Italian. So she always called me Johnny. So anyway, that's my grandmother. But yeah, so that's pretty cool. All right. Great. Well, happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So that was terrific, Tom. Thank